Hi everybody. My father asked me to replace the brakes and struts on his 2006 Mercury Grand Marquis. I couldn't find anything on the internet. Decided to take a few pictures while we did the job to give you the confidence to do the job yourself or the wisdom to have someone else do it. No need to remove the caliper guide pins, which I'm pointing to here. There are two mounting bolts, 18 millimeter in size, on the backside of the caliper. Remove those two and pop the caliper off. With the caliper out of the way, you can move on and pop off the two lock washers on the lugs holding the rotor in order to remove the shock and spring from the car. You basically have to get that steering knuckle out of the way and have the lower control arm as low as possible and basically lift the bottom of the shock up and towards the rear of the car, and the whole assembly will slide out with some effort. In order to do that, I had to remove three nuts. One is the lower control arm ball joint. That's a 24 millimeter nut, and it requires about 166 foot-pounds torque during reinstallation. That's the first one. The second one was the outer tie rod and to the steering knuckle. That was an 18 millimeter bolt and required about 59 foot-pounds on installation. And the third was the stabilizer bar to the link nut, and that was a 15 millimeter bolt, which required 41 foot-pounds. On the last two items, the outer tie rod and the stabilizer bar, you could use an 8 millimeter socket to hold, or an adjustable wrench to hold that bolt in place while you're trying to loosen the nut. On the lower control arm ball joint, I used an air gun, um, but I understand that there is a 6 millimeter hex at the bottom of that bolt that you could use to turn the nut. Because I was using the air tools, it simply just took a little bit of time, but the nut eventually came off pretty easily. The repair manual called for removing the upper ball joint nut. However, we couldn't figure that out, so we decided to remove the lower ball joint nut. Either way, I'd recommend taking the ABS plug out of the sensor on the wheel, on the steering knuckle, and putting it in a safe place. All right, with the three main nuts out of the way, uh, what we did next was remove the upper strut mounting nuts, 13 millimeter deep socket. They require about 22 foot-pounds on reinstallation. Next is the strut to lower control arm mounting bolt. It's 24 millimeter, requires a 166 foot-pounds. I only had a 150-pound torque wrench, so it was a 150 plus kind of situation for myself. But in removing that lower bolt, you may need to make use of a jack to move the control arm or up and down, or I think what worked better for us was a uh, large screwdriver mounted in the front hole after you use a punch to get that bolt to move through the channel. We used a flathead screwdriver there to basically use that leverage to allow the pin to come out. I think we had to actually unscrew it so the threads were actually pulling it out. So with all the nuts out of the way, I had to, the first wheel I did was on the passenger side, so I turned the steering knuckle as if I were making a right-hand turn and pushed down extremely on the lower control arm. And what this does is allow the uh, ball joint bolt to come out of the steering knuckle. Once that's done, the steering knuckle is basically free. You can uh, tie it off to the side as I had to do. And then the next step in this process, I believe I put a strap, and I'll show you that photo, on the upper control arm so I could lift that as high as I could, while my father stepped on the lower control arm, and we both exerted some force there to push that down enough so that the lower end of the strut popped above the control arm, and at that point I could take it and wiggle it towards the rear of the car, and the whole strut and or shock and spring assembly came out pretty easily at that point. So now that you have the shock and spring out of the car, it's time to reinstall the new one. So I took a look at the new shock here and aligned it so that the spring ended in the same spot. So you're basically looking at the strut as it's going to be installed in the vehicle. Plus, you can't miss this up because there are three uh, bolts up top that must align with the frame. So there's no wrong way to put this in. It's just I like to be extra sure. Another thing I noticed is the bolts on top of the new strut were much larger or longer than the original assembly. So this made reinstallation a little bit more challenging. So at this point in the job, you're looking forward to this new challenge, and I think it basically required us to really push down on that control arm, uh, so that you had enough room to guide the assembly, the quick strut, back into position just like it came out, and align those three bolts into the upper mounting frame, and have your partner put a nut on one of those once you get all three through. Then you can take a much needed rest and continue the reinstallation. Once we got the quick strut back in place, I hand tightened all of the nuts. I'll rattle them off again for you here, the sizes as well as the torque. So you got the lower control arm ball joint, 24 millimeter bolt, about 166 foot-pounds. You got the outer tie rod end to the steering knuckle. That was 18 millimeter, about 59 foot-pounds. You got the stabilizer bar to link. That's the upper um, link. That's 15 millimeter, 41 foot-pounds. You got the shock to lower control arm mounting bolts. This is the 24 millimeter nut, 166 foot-pounds. Then the upper strut mounting nuts, 13 millimeter. You got to use a deep socket there because of those extra long bolts. That was 22 foot-pounds. You got to reconnect the ABS electric sensor, so be careful doing that. And then the caliper is the 18 millimeter bolts with 27 foot-pounds. I actually show the C-clamp here, compressing the pistons and greasing up and reinserting the new brake pads. Just before putting the tire back on and letting the car down, we decided to bleed the brake system. I'm glad we did. Uh, it was not only greenish tint, but it was also dirty. So poured some new brake fluid in there. I still need to research whether or not there was green brake fluid in the car to begin with. I don't know, but it was dirty enough that justified the bleeding of the brakes. And here's a thumbs up parting shot from my father with his two granddaughters. That's it. Hope this video has helped you out.